The first step I want to take is to look carefully at the work of Sonia Livingston and Peter Lunt and just make sure that we all understand what they are suggesting about the nature of media policy. And what this means is relating media policy back to the theme of how media actively creates social reality, and this involves connecting policy with the concept of imagination. So, when Sonia Livingston and Peter Lunt began writing about media policy in the early part of the 21st century, they put into place a few useful principles that we can use to apply to policy wherever it exists. And I want to just quickly go over those principles and explain how they can relate to the concept of alcohol advertising in Asia. So the context of this is that Sonia Livingston and Peter Lunt are both very important media scholars whose work is very much respected in policy circles. And we see this in the work that they've done in the United Kingdom. And giving you a brief and very sparse history, the early 21st century saw a real revolution in how British media policy developed in regard to digital media practices. So, like the rest of the world, the British state was very aware that we were moving into a new media era where the sorts of rules that we had that tried to make sure that things went ahead fairly under broadcast circumstances no longer applied. So there were a range of new approaches and working papers on how to approach digital media policy that was organised by the government body Ofcom. And Sonia Livingston and Peter Lunt, as two of the UK and indeed the world's leading media experts, particularly around issues of young people and media, were asked to do a lot of research on how best to regulate the media in the public interest. And the paper that I've asked you to read for this week is a short working paper that was written about around 2007. But I think it's a really important paper as well because it really summarizes a number of very, very important principles that can be related to a number of other times and other places. And so I just want to go through, really, just two of those points because they're quite simple, but they can be fruitfully applied to a number of different areas. And the first is that that media policy isn't a passive thing. The first point that Livingston and Lunt talked about was that in their observations of early 21st century British policy, what they were seeing were policies that imagined a certain kind of media user. And that media user was an individual who was highly aware of their needs and highly able to say what they needed from the media. That is the a lot of the media policy of the early 21st century that Sonia Livingston and Peter Lunt were looking at. They criticized it on the basis of, they said, well, if you look at all of these documents, they're kind of imagining a media user who is highly intelligent, who is highly used to making their own choices as a consumer. And that notion of the consumer is really, really important. And knows what to do if they find themselves in a situation where they are displeased with the products they are buying. And the point that they made was that early 21st century media policy in the United Kingdom, at least, seemed to assume that there was a kind of an equality, an equivalence between the identity of the citizen and the identity of the consumer. It kind of assumed that through the aggregation of consumer choices through allowing consumers to have access to a diverse range of media products from which they could pick, choose, and complain if they didn't like what they could see, that the media could be regulated through that consumer mechanism, and that ultimately there were fairly close parallels between the identities of consumer and citizen. And Livingston and Lunt made two really, really important points around this. The first was that in imagining that type of media user, firstly, there was a problem in the sense that there are key differences between the identities of the consumer and the citizen, and that we really need to think about what those differences are when we're doing things like creating state policy, for example. The second thing, however, was that these policy documents weren't neutral things. They became powerful, persuasive tools in and of themselves, that in constantly talking to citizens as if they were consumers, they were also popularizing and disseminating a particular kind of language that encouraged audiences or ordinary people, the public, to take it, to occupy a particular position that had been made for them. That is, the media policy was one of the places, according to Livingston and Lunt, where the idea that the best citizen is one who acts like a consumer was made to appear common sense. So one of the things that Livingston and Lunt talked about was the way that media policy was not simply regulating media, but also creating a powerful language way of thinking, and if you like, a script that people could use to make sense of their relationship to the media and to society. And so what we're introduced to is the idea that media policy is one of the battlegrounds where we see competing versions of what it is to be a citizen, and therefore how citizens should be treated. And one of the areas, so the idea here is that media policy is one of the things that encourages us to take certain subject positions in society. And therefore, in a strange way, there are some very interesting parallels between media regulation and the language of advertising itself. And it's these parallels that I want to explore. But just to give you an example of how this works. One of the things that we can talk about again is the idea that media policy, in a sense, becomes another one of the languages through which media encourages us to become particular kinds of people. And we're quite familiar with this idea when it comes to advertising. But what I want to do in the forthcoming videos is just think about how we can reflect these same ideas onto policy. So one of the things that we know from alcohol advertising and from advertising in general is that it works by imagining a certain kind of consumer. And alcohol advertising is especially interested in this because one of the things that we've seen in industrial practices over the last decade or so is the way that the alcohol industry has fairly deliberately and fairly aggressively tried to imagine new kinds of consumers, tried to expand its footprint by targeting new groups of drinkers to rebrand particular kinds of products through creating a relationship between those products and imagined and also desirable lifestyles. One of the examples that I especially like is the Korean drink soju. So soju is a kind of a very, very strong rice wine, I guess, which would typically in Korean culture be drunk from a shot glass. And in the way that it's something that is quite frequently consumed, for example, at barbecues, and we kind of quite often we might think of soju as kind of in masculine terms. So the picture, of course, on the right is the Korean K-pop star Psy. downing soju with, I'm sure many of you will recognize the American rapper Snoop Dogg at a Korean barbecue. And this is very much the kind of the normal image of soju that you would have found in South Korea. And what begins to happen in around 2008 is that soju manufacturers begin to target new women consumers. And what you can see is that in their advertising, what they try and do is speak a very, very different language, is locate soju as a drink that fits with a very different kind of lifestyle than the typical lifestyle around masculinity and excess that you see portrayed to the right. And so there's two kind of points to be made here. Firstly, that there are kind of interesting parallels between policy and advertising in terms of the way that both act as discourses that create certain kinds of social realities and imagine certain kinds of social worlds that consumers then or citizens then live out. But the second thing is that in thinking about images like this, it's a really handy way of identifying exactly why media policy is difficult to formulate through the question of why is it difficult to regulate media messages that promote drinking. And there's a strong gendered element to that I'm going to be talking about. So as we move forward, we're going to be thinking more about advertising as, like policy, as a kind of a language of imagination, as a language that imagines certain kinds of social worlds, and talking about how that practice actually makes another form of imagination, the imagination of a media policy that would truly serve society, becomes much more difficult to realize.